it's here. Yeah, no, that's right. Start. Yeah, I'll give you a wave from the back when we've made the live stream go live.
Okay, cool. Hello. Hello, good evening to everyone. Hello to the brave souls who've come here in person in real life. And hello to those who are watching digitally on our live stream feed. My name's Vanessa Norwood. I'm Creative Director of the Building Centre. The Building Centre was started in 1931 as a place where students, architects, anyone interested in the built environment could come and see the materials that made up the architecture of the built environment. So we're very excited to have worked with the V&A and with Simona Valeriani on this project, Shaping Space, Architectural Models Revealed. Model making has a fascination and a joy for everybody. And it's been really nice seeing how students and visitors have interacted with the exhibition. And a great part of this project is sharing the world of models and the way that models are used in thinking, in architecture. So this particular evening session will be aimed at sixth formers who might be thinking, what are they going to do with the rest of your life? And I think the model is a really good way of starting up a conversation about architecture and thinking and making. So I'm going to actually hand over now to Simona Valeriani, my co-curator and colleague through all of this, and say, good evening, Simona, to tell us more.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Vanessa. As Vanessa was saying, this is part of a bigger project that is about the exhibition and about sharing with different audiences our love for models, but also a bit of the insight of what can we learn from models and how do they open up architecture and design more generally for us. So this evening we are delighted to have. Am I producing it? Okay. We are delighted to have two speakers from Manchester talking to us. Matt Ault is here in the room, being a senior lecturer at Manchester School of Architecture, who has kindly agreed to speak to us about, what does a career in architecture mean? How can you get there? What are the different path that you can follow, and what kind of different kinds of architects can you be? And then we will have, in complete kind of hybrid style, our second speaker appearing on the screen for us because he is still in Manchester, and I will introduce him in a minute. And I would also like to use this opportunity to thank the University of Manchester and the Manchester School of Architecture, who have also financially helped us to bring this and other parts of the project to you. So a very official thanks also to Manchester University, and welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much. Seems to be, I can hear the reverb. But no, thank you very much, Vanessa and Simona. So I think, yeah, I'm an architect. I'm a qualified architect and worked in practice for several years before moving back into academia. And I think hopefully in this short presentation I'll give you an insight into different kinds of architecture, different kinds of architects that you might be aspiring to be. But I think the way into that perhaps is to think about models, think about model making. So when you have an opportunity later to see the exhibition, I think it might be really useful to think about what those models are used for. So in architecture, we use models for perhaps the very early stages. So if you imagine like a hand-drawn sketch, we might make a quick maquette, something that externalizes and kind of represents an idea that we might have, so that we can communicate to others. And it will be taken forward and developed in much more detail and interrogated through the process of the architectural project. But we might also have models that might be much more interaction. So you might make a model which you're using to explore materiality. You're trying to perhaps uncover kind of morphologies or forms or kinds of spaces that you might not have been able to think of in your mind. As we move through the process of an architectural project, there's different stages. So it might be that once we've developed our idea, we need to represent that and communicate with a client. It might be we need to communicate with an engineer. We need to make sure that what we're thinking has been expressed and can be communicated clearly to somebody else, so there's no ambiguity there. So it forms a kind of visual representation. So they could be kind of small-scale models. They could equally be a full-scale visual representation. So in practice, sometimes we create, I'm kind of stretching the idea of the model here, but the idea that we can, as architects, we sometimes design things which aren't buildings, but they are part of that design process. So sometimes we mock up an actual room so that we can discuss with a client or, as I say, an engineer or another stakeholder. We're trying to communicate that idea and test it to see if it looks as we thought it would when we drew it or when we made the scale model. So there's other, and I guess that word testing, so often we make models which might be digital as well, digital or physical models to test ideas, to again see if they function as we anticipated. And also to demonstrate things, to say, well, it definitely does. It does as we expected, or we might need to change our idea, change our design. So I think in thinking about models and model making, it's a way into thinking of the different kinds of skills we need, the different qualities we might need as an architect. So for you guys, if you're thinking currently about architecture and you're thinking, is it the profession for you? Is it the career path that you would like? I think personally my advice would be, if you can identify things that you like to do, either subjects at school or your A-level choices, think about perhaps where you might fit within that process. And I think for me, the variety and the diversity in architecture was the appeal. I really like engaging with different people, knowing a little bit about a lot of different subjects, or working with specialists and engineers and so on. So I think in terms of the qualities that benefits architecture, I think it's both the creative imagination, the kind of thinking outside of the box and perhaps connecting different ideas that inform these early stage processes of these early ideas of an architectural project. But equally, we need to be quite logical, we need to be quite rigorous as architects. And again, through the models, we're validating ideas, we're testing them. And as I mentioned earlier, there's that important collaboration with others, so communication is really key, whether that's graphically through drawing or whether it's through verbal communication or models as well. So in architecture, it's both a profession and a discipline that deals with design, but it's also very important that we think about the professional aspect. So alongside the design and the creativity, the problem solving, there's also the responsibilities that come with being a professional. So that might be to do with kind of ethical things, to do with creating safe and healthy spaces for your clients and the end users, but also thinking about how to construct, how to build in a safe way. So all of these things are kind of tied up, and I think at any stage along that process, it's possible to have models and modeling, model making. So again, the thing I'd like to emphasize to you is the diversity. So if you're considering becoming an architect, there's all sorts of different scales of project, different sectors of project that you might go into. But something that we talk about as part of the course at Manchester is the idea that every architectural project, it kind of has the same design parameters. We're always designing environments and spaces to enable some function or support some human activity. So I guess the other thing to say is that you might also consider architecture in the sense of research. So you might not be perhaps focused on becoming an architect in the traditional sense, but within architecture there's lots of research that might be technological. So it might relate to, here there's an example of how people are exploring robotics and technologies in construction to try and expand what's possible in terms of how we build. But it might be that you're interested in policy or politics or other aspects of architecture. So again, just to emphasize that a degree in architecture or a career in architecture might have different, you might follow different routes through that. So in terms of the traditional route, the typical route through architecture would be to firstly do your part 1, so that's usually a 3-year degree, an undergraduate degree, followed by a year of professional experience. So throughout the typical routes through architecture, there's instances where you have professional experience, professional placements. So typically there's a 3-year degree, you work in practice for a year, then you do your second degree, which is 2 years, and then you're on into your studies for your professional qualification, which allows you to become a registered architect, which typically takes, it typically takes more than a year, but it would be a minimum of 1 year. So that's the sort of the typical traditional route to becoming an architect. But you might start in architecture and you might move elsewhere. I mean, it's quite difficult as a 16, 17, 18-year-old to actually know with certainty where you want to be heading or to commit to a career path at that point. And I think with architecture, it's actually an excellent degree to actually provide a platform for many different routes. So it provides you with that kind of, like we said, the problem solving, the critical thinking, independence, all of these qualities that are actually desired by employers. And certainly on our courses, the employability of the graduates is 98 and 99% year on year. So it's a very, very good basis. If you think it's something you'd like to do right now, but you're unsure, then you can go down that route and it still opens up opportunities. But similarly, you might start elsewhere. So I've worked with colleagues and met people who have begun as architectural technologists, or they've begun in interior architecture or other construction disciplines, even in psychology. It's quite a broad range of starting points that can actually lead you into architecture as well. And that's actually how I came into architecture. I began with a degree, I graduated with a degree in structural engineering, which was with architecture, so there was a small element, and it was with French, because when I was 18, I wanted to make sure I learnt languages and I travelled. But then as I graduated, I realised that it was the architectural elements that really interested me. So the path that I've taken is quite similar to some of the part-time routes or the flexible and apprenticeship routes that are becoming quite common now. And these routes allow you to combine experience in practice alongside the vast majority of your learning and your academic qualifications. So for me, I had 2 years of architectural practice before I actually did my final year of my part 1. So this meant I had really great insight to a 2-year construction project, which literally from the ground up, from the foundations up through the frame and the fit out. So that when I moved back into academia to do my final year, I was able to bring in some of that learning, that knowledge of procurement and working with the design team and all of the different disciplines. I was able to bring that into my student work. And also just to highlight in terms of the variety of projects, this was another project I did at the same time, which was a small, the previous one was a health centre project in Salford in the northwest of England. So it was healthcare, it was a community facility, community amenity, whereas this project was on a much smaller scale. So again, it might be that you're interested in big things or small things. It might be that it's the community aspect that you're interested in. It could be working with existing buildings, which is becoming more and more important in terms of sustainability, or conservation as well, again, working with existing buildings. But again, I was able to bring in the things I was learning in practice into the final year project. So this was my 3rd year project for my part 1, which was a kind of community regeneration project in Ancoats, in just north of the city centre in Manchester. So again, it was quite a sophisticated response at that point in terms of procurement, funding, the technical and technological aspects, the kind of the urban scale, all of these things that I could bring in from my practice experience. So I think always, if you do go into architecture, I think see these see these experiences as complementary, the things that you will learn in the studio at university as well as those things that you learn in professional practice. But when I got to my part 2, which is the second degree that you do, I was starting to read different books, and there was things that were kind of things that I'd never seen before, things that I wanted to learn about. So I think architecture gives you that opportunity to satisfy your curiosities and to learn, and that was something that I've really enjoyed throughout my career. So both in practice as well, whenever you start a new project, there's always new challenges, new problems to solve, new people to work with. So again here, lots of models, both digital and physical, looking at materiality, and eventually bringing these through into a project, which was a theatre, a floating theatre project, which gave me the opportunity to be able to think about these tools, these methods, these models, these digital modelling techniques, and apply these to these spaces and environments in a creative way. So as I moved on, so after finishing my part 2, I joined Foster & Partners in London. So after the part 2, this is the point where you start to do your professional qualification. So at that point I was working on quite large projects internationally. But all of that learning previously, all of that exposure to site projects, to digital tools and methods, that really benefited me as I moved into a big international practice. And I guess one thing to say is when you work on very large projects, it might be that you become an expert in a certain aspect. So I think on this project I was on the cladding team for quite a long time. So again, there's a very different experience to be had in very large practices as there is in very small projects and small practices. But also the opportunities that a career in architecture might give you. So if you're interested in perhaps travel and the international aspects, or equally it could be other aspects to do with community, you're able to perhaps engage with those things through architecture, through building projects. So this was a project. It's probably the best view from a site project that I've worked on. So this was a site in Morocco in North Africa. So I worked there and also travelled quite a lot to the Middle East. But then in 2016, I decided it was time to move back into academia. So something completely different. However, instead of working with services engineers and structural engineers, I was now collaborating with other colleagues in the art school. So instead of looking at columns and beams and so on, we were looking at architectural textiles, working with textile designers and experts in knit, which we explored in some of the teaching projects, which was quite good fun. Again, models and large-scale installations and so on, which some of the students then took forward and created an installation at the Blue Dot Festival in Drodrell Brank in Cheshire. And then an example there of some of the installation work at the end of year show at the School of Architecture in Manchester. So I think, as I've been saying, the diversity and the variety that a degree or a career in architecture offers you, I think is really key. And also, when you study architecture, the best courses are the ones that enable you to become the architect that you want to become, that allows you to explore those curiosities, or to focus in on that particular aspect of architecture that you're really interested in. So I'd recommend that you go to the end of year shows, the degree shows, and see all of the work and the models, just to perhaps maybe see where you might fit in that spectrum of architecture. We also have the publications online on the website, so that's another location to perhaps try and see what's on offer and where you might fit within that. And that's where I'll end. Okay.
Thank you very much, Matt. I suggest that we take question at the end all together. because now, with the magic of Harriet in the background, who is masterminding everything, yes, we will have the pleasure of having a contribution by Scott. Here he is. You look huge in the room.
Don't feel that big here.
So Scott Miller is the head of the very well-known workshop for architectural model making at the Manchester School of Architecture, where all the students work to develop their idea, develop their skills in model making. And he has kindly agreed to speak to you from a different perspective about possible careers within the world of architecture that are linked directly with making and with the kind of skills that he has developed. So thank you very much, Scott, for joining us from afar. And I'll just be quiet in a corner now.
Thank you very much, Simona. Right, let me just see if I can get my screen on full. It's going to work. Here we go. Right. Okay, so hi everybody, and thank you for joining us. Thank you, Simona, for the invite. Following on from Matt, I'm going to give you a kind of brief insight into what model making means for architects, architectural education, and a little bit more about kind of my career and how I ended up doing this job that I do now, running the workshop. So what we've got on the screen here is a picture of my tools at home and a picture of the house that I grew up in. And so for me, the idea of going to university really only entered my head around the time that I was at college and other people were starting to talk about it and apply to go to different courses. And that was really because nobody in my family had ever been to university before. It wasn't something that they'd ever given any thought to or any discussion. So it never entered my head to think about going. So at that time I was doing a foundation degree in art and design at the college where I was here in Manchester. And a technician there suggested that I should look for a course that specialized in model making, because I always seemed to be making things. And, you know, I hadn't really consciously thought of that before. But sure enough, there was a degree in model making, and I applied for it, not really knowing what I was doing, you know, what direction I was going to go with it. But at the time, I happened to be making this model of my parents' house, which you can see sat in front of it there. And I enjoyed doing it immensely, just as a kind of, as a hobby. But in this case, it was actually part of my studies. But it made me realize, because of the kind of sudden structure or pressure to have to do this for a project, that I didn't really understand any of the processes fully, or the purpose of making such things, if indeed there was one. And so the degree, or the idea of going on a degree, gave me the opportunity to kind of put some structure to all of that. So just move on there. So I began my model making degree down in Bournemouth, and it was definitely one of the best decisions that I'd made, even though at the time, as I say, there was many aspects of it that I didn't really understand, to do with the course itself, but also the kind of career that it was going to lead towards. And so that's what a lot of degrees, including the architecture degree here, will give you, is that kind of structure and make sense of things that you may not fully understand at the moment. So it gave me practical lessons in processes such as moulding and casting, like the sort of stages you can see on the screen there. And it allowed me to continue being creative, but critically, it increased my awareness of and understanding of how I could use these practical and transferable skills. And it made me interrogate those reasons as to why, you know, what it was actually for. And throughout the course, I involved in all sorts of different projects, but I ended up focusing a lot on things like this. So this was one of the projects that I worked on, which taught me to manage and plan my ideas as to how they were executed. So another important lesson of all of this was the value of recording process and making time to sort of reflect and improve on what I'd done for the next time. So that video there, let's play it one more time, it shows me building what was part of one of my final projects at university, which is a building of Foster and Partners Renault building, as it was then known, which was a company that Matt mentioned he worked for, although he was working there many years before I ever met him. So show you a couple of finished images of it. So that was the finished piece. So it was like a 1 to 20 section model of this structure, which was quite famous, how sort of striking it was when it was built back in the 80s. And I think it was even in a James Bond film. So this model ended up getting a lot of attention, and as a result of it being in part of my end of year show, it allowed me to find employment. It actually sort of won me an award and got lots of attention at this graduation show, which is called New Blades, which is a model making show that happens in London every year, run by the 4D Model Making Workshop. So moving on from that, after graduation, I was able to work in all sorts of different companies and on different projects, such as this, which is a very strange one, which I did while I was working at a company called Creative Service Industries. And this, as you can see, it was a giant Adidas trainer. So it's not architecture at all, but it was a sort of transferable skill to be able to produce all sorts of different things, ranging from set designs, exhibitions, prop making, promotional pieces like this. Something that I never would have imagined that I'd be paid to do, but it was, you know, great fun to do it. But despite all these kind of different things, I still found myself always doing some kind of architectural project. So I don't know why this took me so long to figure this out, but I was doing this and people wanted me to do it, but it wasn't really kind of obvious in my head that this was something I should focus on. And so eventually I was still doing projects like this, which was a kind of church development model, a presentation model that I did for a project in South Manchester. And I was doing this freelance and for companies when I got asked to come and help out at what is the B15 model making workshop at Manchester School of Architecture. So at MSA, there are two sets of workshops. There are some that are in Manchester Metropolitan University and some that are in the University of Manchester. And so the one that I manage now is located in the University of Manchester. It's been there for 51 years in the same place. So it's got this rich heritage of model making. It provides a kind of studio-like environment for the architects. So they don't just come and get something and then leave. They come and they develop their ideas and work through them. And the area kind of exposes people to a whole different range of manufacturing techniques, a lot of which I touched upon in my degree, and it had kind of given me the confidence to help kind of support others in trying to learn about these different things. So when it comes to learning and designing, there are many different tools and methods that we can use to help us develop and understand ideas within architecture. As Matt stated, physical model making is one of these methods, and it has links to many different parts of the architectural design process and also in other design careers. Often we tend to think of models as being miniature worlds that are somehow toy-like in their nature. I can certainly kind of relate to that. I love how much they draw you into these different kind of worlds. They allow us to view things and manipulate things in ways that we often can't comprehend until we build and experience the real building. And so by that alone, they're worth making as an architect, because they allow us to explore things that otherwise would be extremely expensive to do. But what are they actually for? So there's different types. There's sort of sketch and concept models that are essentially the first time that we take an idea from a sketch off the page of a piece of paper into 3 dimensions. And these kind of models are rough and ready. We're not particular about their finish. They're not exact in every detail, but they simply allow us to see how something might appear without too much thought, as there are many different other aspects of the design that have to be considered before anything like this might be built at full scale. They're just literally to give us that initial idea and help us understand the space. You know, sometimes some things that may seem clear to us on paper, more often than not raise multiple questions when we actually translate them into 3 dimensions for the first time. So these kind of models can go through many different iterations before a successful form is decided on. And who determines what this success is depends on the purpose of the model, but certainly in the kind of early stages, it's more than likely you as the designer that decides if the model has given you the answers that you set out to get or not. It may also need the approval of a team leader or your tutor, or perhaps the company or the person who's paying for a project. And so the types and kind of extent that which we go into model making really depends on why we're making it. And that's something that we have to interrogate right at the start of a project and figure out what it is we're aiming for. So how do we determine what kind of model will help us explore a particular aspect of our ideas? Well, it's very circumstantial, and taking the time to think about that before we begin is very important. So I have to often explain to students, I use this kind of analogy where I'm sort of saying, imagine you're looking out of an aeroplane window, and so we can see the whole area, we can see everything that surrounds it, but we can't really see the details. So these steps over the next few slides show you how we're kind of zooming out of that aeroplane and getting closer and closer to the object. So we're changing scale each time. We're getting a little bit closer down to from a city scale down all the way to when we're looking through a building, we're cutting it in half as a section and we're able to see what's actually inside there. And even further, looking at individual floors, how it's technically built. And then at the 1-to-1, which is the full scale example of how a technical detail might actually be assembled. So these are all really useful methods. But as you can see, you can't kind of combine all of the things that they tell us into one model because there is just too many different things going on there. So thinking about that, why we're doing it, helps us to decide which one of these might benefit the project the most at that particular time. So a key theme that you may notice reoccur in a lot of the things I've been saying here is communication, and that models are all about communication to ourselves and to others. And they have the ability to effectively convey the simple and complex aspects of building design in more of a tangible and tactile way than that both kind of entices and engages people to want to know more about it. Equally, they also have the power to mislead, and so deciding what we're trying to achieve with the model is an essential starting point. As Matt mentioned, all of this work results in a student end-of-year exhibition, and this, unfortunately, over the last couple of years has had to be done online because of the pandemic situation, but we still managed to get people making things. This example was from a few years ago, one of the end-of-year shows that the students are featured in. And similarly to my own experience on the model making degree, the graduation or the degree shows were really kind of critical in serving as a launch pad to get into employment. So potential employers could see the work that students have done. There's a number of organized events where people come in to get to actually chat to you and find out more about your work, see the models, see all your digital work and your drawing work. And it's a real mix of paths from that point. So some people, they follow the full route as Matt stated, and they'll go all the way into a career in architecture. Others take slightly different paths, such as Philippa here, she ended up, she was a sort of She was an assistant to us in the workshop very briefly, and then went on to work in a local architecture company, and now she works for BIG, who are based in Denmark. And she's not an architect, she's a model maker, because she really liked model making, and so that was what she tried to focus on in her career, and she was able to do that. Others have done the same. This is Pete. He did both his Part 1 and his Part 2 degree with us, and he now works as a qualified architect and a model maker in practice in Berlin. And he loves model making, and this kind of path that where you can go in different directions is something, as Matt said, that architecture gives you all of these options. And so even if you're not quite sure about what it is you want to do at this stage, there are plenty of directions that those core skills can take you in. So it's a really valuable all-rounder kind of degree. So if you'd like to find out more, there's the main MSA website on screen there, and there's also our blog for the workshop, and you can follow us on social media where you can see more kind of current, up-to-date things of what's actually going on in the workshop, and those are very popular. Now, I know I'm about at my full time here, but I've got another 2 minutes I want to spend with you to quickly show you this trailer for a film that we had produced a few years ago, and this will give you a bit more of a flavor of the sort of things that go on at the workshop. I'll just click play, because I know we're up against it with the time, so if you just watch. People are more willing to come and experiment in this place and allow themselves to grow, allow the work they're doing to develop.
When the tutor said, well, do this by hand, I would be like, yeah, well, but we grew up with computers and this is like how we learn best and stuff. But I think model making is something that is completely different from computer models. You get a whole different sort of relationship to your building by holding it in your hands and like feeling it.
Because I finished 1 to 200,000, the small model I took. Yes, it's the whole city.
You need to be willing to sort of progress with the model. It needs to be ever-changing as the project progresses.
I do explore my mind when I'm working like this.
It's the free space where people can come and experiment and try different things. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to stop sharing that now. So as it said on the screen there, you can watch that full, it's a 20-minute film. You can find that on our blog. And it's sort of like a year in the workshop condensed into 20 minutes, just to give you a flavor of a few of the different experiences and journeys that people go on during any given academic year here. So yes, so that's about it from me. So I think both me and Matt are happy to answer any questions if anybody has any on the subject. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you both Matt and Scott. I'll hand back over to Matt for the questions. Certainly get an idea of the breadth of architecture as a profession, from learning, thinking to making. I quite fancy being a model maker. Maybe I'll come up to Manchester and give it a go. I'll hand over to Matt and see if anyone, I don't know if anyone in the room has got any questions for Matt. Matt, here's the...
Thank you very much. Any questions? Lady at the front. Yeah.
If I was looking to study architecture at university, what would you say would be the key things to look out for in choosing somewhere to go?
Okay. So for the benefit of those at home, the question is, what are the key things to look out for when considering a degree in architecture?
Yeah, where to go to university.
Where to,
choosing where to go.
yeah, I think as I said maybe in the presentation, I think it's really important to identify what it is that you're interested in personally. So both think about what the courses offer, but also, yeah, the place that you want to be. I mean, I think Scott was in Manchester previously, but for me, the city was really important as well, like the city that I wanted to live in, both culturally and I guess architecturally perhaps as well. But I think that being able to explore your curiosities, being able to explore the things that you want to do in the degree is a really important thing. I think sometimes, I don't know, well, I guess, yeah, if the course is clearly offering a large range of different kinds of design, different kinds of architecture, exciting teaching techniques and so on, and bringing in research as well, I think they're things to look out for in the courses. I'm not sure if that answers the question. Yeah.
Matt, you spoke briefly about some colleges where you can do learning and working. I think there are changing now, isn't it? There's courses where you can actually do both, be in practice.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, so I think, yeah, so increasingly, I think, I was going to say actually, I think in the presentation, the 7 years, and that's kind of 7 years as a minimum really, is something that historically and actually now with changing funding models for kind of student loans and student fees and things, I think these new models, these new routes through with the apprenticeships, with kind of part-time approaches, I think that often makes it a little bit more accessible perhaps, just like I found. I did my degree in engineering and didn't want to then take out a whole new series of loans and rack up more fees and things to pay. So I decided that was a really good route for me, and I think maybe for others as well. You're able to both gain that experience, which benefits your learning. It means you can transfer across from academia into practice and vice versa, but equally, and maybe more importantly for some, you're able to earn at the same time. So I think those kinds of models can perhaps help with that, providing ways into the profession. There's also foundation courses, I think, starting to appear. So sometimes that's a good way, perhaps if you didn't quite meet the grades that were required, it's a way to perhaps just kind of top up, I guess, and reach that level to be able to then access those courses.
And I have a question for Scott. Actually, do people leave to go into architecture mainly, or are there other kinds of professions that people head to? What do people end up doing after they've studied with you?
I'd say the majority of them do follow that route into architecture, but there are the alternative routes into careers like model making. Set design is another popular one that people have deviated into, but it really depends on the individual's desire, how far they want to take it, because as Matt said, it can be quite a long process to go through, and so sometimes variety can help a lot. So we have had people that they've done their part one, and then they've gone into working in a kind of a practical field, doing not in architecture, so they're not doing what you call your part one placement, they're perhaps working at a model making company, or they're working at a furniture makers, for example, doing quite practical things that they've just picked up whilst at university, and they enjoyed doing that aspect of the course. So you can do things like that and then choose to come back to architecture to finish the kind of part 2 and part 3 of the studies, or they just don't. They stay, similar to Pip, who I mentioned in the presentation, Philippa. She is now a professional model maker, and she didn't go through a sort of formal training as such. She studied to be an architect, and that's what she does for a living now, and it's taken her to Copenhagen as one example. So yeah, I think that there's a whole variety of directions you could go with it, and architecture is a really well recognized profession that, if you can say that you've completed that degree, whichever direction you decide to go, creatively or otherwise, I think it's respected and will do you well.
Thank you. I'm going to hand over to Simona. I think unless anyone else has got any questions in the room, we might close it there. I think, Matt, you had a really great point about looking at all the degree shows. I think that's such a sensible way of getting to see the different fields and work produced by different universities. Most of them were online, which is probably quite handy, isn't it, if you can't travel? But there's nothing quite like visiting them in real life. See exhibitions of architectural models. We have a great one here at the Building Centre called Shaping Space, now until next year. So I'm going to hand you over to Simona, who will say the thank yous and the goodbyes.
Yes, before the thank yous and the goodbyes, I would just like to say, actually, one area that Matt has mentioned for architecture is actually the heritage sector. A prime example, I did graduate as an architect, I did all my training, but then I ended up working at the V&A in a museum, and I teach history of architecture, and I also work in a museum, and I have colleagues who also have an architectural background and work as curators. So you might end up not producing stuff yourself, but having the knowledge of how you make these things will help you understand their history, understand their significance, and be able to mediate it for others. I know many that graduated with me that ended up in journalism, so that they became art critics or kind of culture critics for different newspaper and art journals. So depending on how fixed you are on then producing new architecture yourself, or if it's more about the fascination with the built environment and being able then to work in a way in the wider field of architecture, having a foundation in how these things are made, and having had a little bit of an experience yourself as a student of coming up with ideas and facing the challenges and transforming your idea into something physical, it's quite a good skill. So that was my experience, for what it's worth, that took me where I am now. So thank you very, very much to everybody who is here in the room and to those who are following from home. Thank you very much to the Building Centre for hosting us, and for Manchester School of Architecture and Manchester University for co-funding this event. And for those who are in the room, you are very welcome to come up with us to the exhibition, and we will be delighted to show you around and give you a bit of a sense of how we came to choose the models we chose and what they represent in our minds. And for those who are at home, if you want to come, the exhibition is open every weekdays, Saturdays including, and it will be open at least until the end of January. Come and see it, and yes, we hope you enjoy a career in architecture in general. Goodbye, everybody. Thank you, and bye, Scott.